Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Good evening. Dear friends and colleagues, I hope that those of you who are here are settled in and gradually warming up, and that those of you who are online have something sort of warm and cozy to accompany you on this for this evening's treat. So it gives me very great pleasure to welcome you all to the 37th McDonald Annual Lecture and to introduce Professor Zoë Crossland from Columbia University, who will deliver a lecture enticingly entitled After Landscape. So it is a great honour for me to welcome Zoë back to Cambridge, and indeed I trust that Zoë will not mind us claiming her as one of our own. So Zoë completed her BA in Archaeology and Anthropology here in Cambridge in 1993, before being seduced across the pond to Michigan. We managed to capture her again in 2002 when she returned to a research fellowship in Churchill. But again, rather carelessly for us, she slipped through our fingers, joining Columbia in 2006. And at Columbia, Zoë has held multiple roles. She is Professor of Anthropology and Director of Graduate Studies, and was Director of the Columbia Center for Archaeology. Zoë's major works include the co-edited book A Fine and Private Place, The Archaeology of Death and Burial in Post-Medieval Britain and Ireland, Disturbing Bodies, Anthropological Perspectives on Forensic Archaeology, and the groundbreaking monograph Ancestral Encounters in Highland Madagascar, Material Signs and Traces of the Dead. She is currently co-editing The Malagasy World with Chantal Radamalahi and Christina Douglas. With colleagues from the University of Antananarivo in Madagascar, she co-directs the Sacred Rice Project, and I think we may hear a little more about that in due course. Zoë is also chair of the North American division of the Theoretical Archaeology Group. Now, Zoë's work is multifaceted, but at its core is a deep commitment to advancing anthropological and archaeological theory and ethics. One strand of her critical work focuses on forensic archaeology, the body, death, and burial. And this seminal work explores, and I quote from her 2018 article, Forensic Afterlives, it explores the zones of interdeterminacy between living and dead, between human and non-human, to reveal a more complex humanist subject than that which is usually positioned as the negative pole for post-humanist accounts. Her work, therefore, importantly blurs the boundary between human and non-human in a way which adds nuance to accounts that might otherwise polarize the two in search for non-human agencies. This work on forensic archaeology also offers important critiques of scientific objectivity, the nature of facts and interpretation, and the role of technical experts. Zoë's work offers a series of lessons that I think resonate across archaeology as a discipline. It's in the application of Peircean semiotics where Zoë's ideas have perhaps made most impact, and which links her work on forensics to the landscapes of Madagascar. Here she employs semiotics to explore the interpretive process through which material signs acquire meaning at the interplay of material and immaterial worlds. Zoë entangles these semiotics with oral histories and the construct of wider historical narratives to show how the dead were made present in 19th century historical actors in Malagasy society. And I know that Zoë is going to tell us much more about Madagascar, and so I would simply highlight here the significance of Madagascar as a source of inspiration for interpretations, particularly of things such as monumentality in the British Neolithic, and how Zoë's work has provided much needed nuance to these interpretations. And as I've already noted, Zoë's focus on semiotics issues an important challenge to current tendencies in archaeology that prioritize the present agency of materials over interpretations of missing human representations and meaning. As Zoë writes in Ancestral Encounters, in the move towards the material, questions of representation can slip out of view precisely because they are implicitly associated with the devalued terrain of the subject. She goes on to say that the material trace is always already about what is absent, and understanding of its presence must also be approached through that which is missing. And this focus on absence alongside material presence, I think, links back neatly to Zoë's work on forensics, which, at its core, reminds us that archaeological facts rarely, if ever, speak for themselves, but must be understood in relation to inferred things and ideas which are no longer there. Anyway, so I hope that my muddled thoughts offered in honour of Zoe's inspiring semiotics have not confused you all. And it's my huge pleasure to now hand over to Zoë, who I'm sure will restore some clarity. So Zoë, we are honoured that you have been able to join us this evening and excited to receive your letter. Zoë, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Matt, for that really generous introduction. And thank you for the invitation to come and speak here today. It's a pleasure to be back here in Cambridge, where, as Matt said, I started off my archaeological career. I was an undergraduate when the foundation stone for the McDonald Institute was put in place in June 1992, and I managed to dig up this picture from the Cambridge Evening News. And the vitality and significance of the McDonald Institute today is really a testament to the energy and imagination of Colin Renfrew and his colleagues. And it's wonderful to see the ongoing effects of the kind bequest of Daniel MacLean MacDonald and his wife Winifred. And I'm going to pick up on this question of inheritance later on in the talk. But first, I would like to start in line with the title of my talk by reflecting on landscape archaeology and where we are with it today. In some ways, landscape has never seemed more relevant in the context of the threats to the planet, of the barely restrained extraction of resources, burning of fossil fuels, loss of biodiversity, and the risks of climate change. There has never been more interest in preserving past landscapes and finding ways to recuperate other landscapes, plants, and animals that have been lost. And certainly this is the case in much of the conservation discourse around Madagascar, which emphasizes habitat loss and extinction of the endemic flora and fauna, and the need to protect the natural landscape. And this is the only picture of lemurs you're going to get, so make the most of it. Madagascar is known for its environment and its very charismatic fauna, much more so than its human history, even though there are more than 30 million people living in Madagascar. Often you would hardly know that people live there from accounts that you see on TV and in the newspapers. Just to point to the area that I'm going to be talking about today, it's this area of the Central Highlands, right near the capital city of Antananarivo, right in the center of the island. When you do hear about people in Madagascar, it's usually either in the context of climate disaster, like this famine in the south of Madagascar, which has been called the world's first famine caused by climate change, or in relation to habitat loss. And this is usually blamed on local farming practices, particularly the role of swidden agriculture in the margins of the island's forests. Less highlighted is the history of clear-cut logging by the colonial authorities in the early 20th century and the subsequent market that was created for tropical hardwoods from Madagascar, and also the large-scale mining for nickel, cobalt and ilmenite that are also going on in these zones. We don't hear much about that. Most recently, there's been a protest over a proposed motorway that will link Antananarivo, the capital, just here in the, lower left, and Tuamasna, port town on the east coast. And of course, a lot of attention has been paid to how this will damage protected areas of forest. You can see it cuts right through the rainforest, through these protected areas. And of course, that's terrible because it will create a barrier between different parcels of the forest for animals that will make it difficult for them to move around. And they're already stressed in this area. But also roads are an important vector for illegal logging. So it will probably also increase logging in the areas because of the access. If it goes through. Of course, there's just been a coup in Madagascar, so there's a whole new government in place now, so everything is up in the air at the moment. Anyway, less attention has been paid to how this proposed road will also cut through areas of rice fields in this circled area next to the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Ambuimanga, one of the pair of capitals in the region of Imerina. And here you have the pair of capitals, Ambuimanga, the ancestral capital, and then looking from Ambuimanga towards Antananarivo, the capital that was founded in the end of the 18th century. So one of the things we've been doing as part of the Sacred Rice project is documenting destruction to heritage, working in part with GIS and then ground truthing locally. We're recording things like rice fields and archaeological sites being destroyed by road building and other construction as they're carving away the earth to fill in areas which were previously rice fields and other agricultural land. So there's a kind of double destruction going on as the hillsides are carved out to create fill. And it's this landscape that I want to discuss today. So this is just an image of an archaeological site. You can see here with the ditch around it, and just you can see how the landscape is just carved away over a period of months. And the part of the site where a tomb was supposedly located, although archaeologically it hadn't been detected, but people believed there was a tomb there, that was left to the last, to the end, and then ultimately removed. So this landscape is not prioritized by conservation groups because, and here we have this is the hillside with this site here, and you can see another site that's destroyed and another one at risk here. Just you can show you how it looks after it's been carved away recently. And these landscapes aren't prioritized by conservation groups because it's not rainforest, partly, and also because they're not seen as natural landscapes. The highlands is mostly a mix of grassland and then these cultivated areas. And for a long time, the grasslands of the highlands were understood to be caused by humans and an effect of deforestation. Writers in the colonial period created this sort of imaginary of Madagascar as an island entirely covered by forest. And that's still actually a common public perception that most of the forest has been cut down and cleared by humans. But this recent work on Madagascar's grasslands has shown the antiquity of these grassy systems and that they were shaped by fire and by grazing well before humans arrived. Lake sediment cores also suggest that the highlands can be better characterized as a mix of woodland and grassland, a sort of mosaic landscape before human arrival. And of course, the cultivation of rice reshaped this grassland landscape profoundly, and I'll talk more on that later. But first, I just want to go back to landscape. So landscape archaeology is obviously vital to archaeology. It offers a long-established set of methods developed and popularized, particularly by W.G. Hoskins. It's a really important toolkit for archaeologists. It allows archaeologists to make sense of changes in the landscape over time, and this is done through the traces that are held in the landforms around us. And we might think here of Hoskins' work on medieval field systems that we see here, or Andrew Fleming's important work on the Dartmoor Reefs dating back to the Bronze Age, or Chris Tilley's attentiveness to the mimetic qualities of Neolithic stone monuments in relation to the hills and mountains in West Wales. So in this lecture, I'm not so interested in thinking about landscape archaeology as method. Rather, I want to think about how it's conceptualized and its effects on our narratives of place and placemaking. This means exploring landscape aesthetics within which landscape archaeology is embedded. And if we look back to the 1990s, when the McDonald Institute was founded, at that time, landscape was a hot topic in archaeology, driven particularly by the work of British prehistorians, often in conversation with continental philosophy and theorists such as Tim Ingold. And of course, Phenomenology of Landscape came out in 1994, the same year that the McDonald building opened. So this theoretical work in landscape archaeology was really important for centering the social dimensions of place and for thinking about human bodies in space, and in place rather. But recently, landscape seems to have slipped out of view as a center for theoretical inquiry, despite its continuing relevance. And so my aim in this talk is to think a bit about why this might be and to explore possibilities for going forward. Matthew Johnson, in his 2007 book, Ideas of Landscape, argued that the study of English landscape archaeology is beset by a pervasive and relatively unchallenged romanticism. And this is tied to a failure to engage with the question of how the archaeological work of landscape reinscribes the very history and perspectives that were articulated through landscape aesthetics in the 17th to 19th centuries. So I'm not an art historian, but we can't talk about landscape without at least a few landscape paintings, a few images. A lot has been written about how landscape came into view in Europe in this period between 17th and 19th centuries. Again, the dates are flexible. We see it in art, in literature, and of course in landscape itself, in landscaping. And this structured a particular relationship to place. Also, a lot of ink has been spilled on landscape's possible antecedents, whether dating back to the classical period or looking at even at China in the early first millennium, CE, other places where landscape aesthetics has evolved or emerged. And I'm not going to get into those details today, except I just want to note a few key features. And here I'd like to highlight the productive ambiguities of landscape as highlighted by geographer Dennis Cosgrove. First, the notion of landscape incorporates both the environment as object of study and then also the subjective experience of place. It pays close attention to the physical stuff of place, but also to the feelings and associations evoked by it. It's often portrayed very naturalistically, like this image here by Constable. And we can think about the picturesque or the sublime and the ways in which these sorts of landscape images call forth different affects or feelings. Landscape also acknowledges the social nature of place and its creation, the involvement of people in the shaping and making of landscape. There was real interest in nature and natural landscapes at this period, but also a recognition of how the land was modified by those who lived on it. So we have this view of the collective work of landscape, while at the same time, landscape painting also privileges the individualized experience of place by the observer, by the person looking out at landscape. And this exploits the development of linear perspective in art and creates a sense of a real landscape being perceived by one person, often through a slight framing device such as trees or rocks in the foreground. So there's an interplay between the inside and outside of place here with landscape. Those who work the land and working landscapes themselves are rarely the focus of landscape painting, as Raymond Williams noted, but instead animals or people may be placed in there to heighten the sense of the view. They're not individualized portraits, they're just their figures in the landscape. And meanwhile, the observer who takes in landscape is not right there in there with the figures, but rather observes from a location that is slightly withdrawn, looking down slightly on the view. So landscape affects a kind of separation between those who observe and the place observed, while also bringing the two into conversation. Okay, so all this is well known in relation to landscape painting, but we have to think too about how these tensions inform the work we do as archaeologists. Landscape offers a lot, but it comes with a lot of baggage. As archaeologists, a landscape view is very helpful in that it encourages us to think regionally, to move beyond sites, and to think about relationships between landscape elements rather than focusing simply on mapping settlements as dots on a map. It also directs us to foreground the human experience of place and to think about politics of place as well. And most importantly, I think, if we look back to the writing of the 1990s, we can see that landscape archaeology refused the entreaties of social constructivism, insisting always on something that remained outside of the socially constructed, foregrounding the tangible features of place and their role as medium and outcome of human action. So the picturesque landscape gardens of the 18th century that we continue to enjoy today show clearly how place itself was a medium through which new forms of modern subjectivity emerged. And landscape is not a neutral way of seeing the land. As I'm sure this audience is aware, the appreciation of landscape came into being in the context of radical changes in society and economy. We can think about the development of mercantile capitalism, the increased alienation of labor, colonization, the commodification of enslaved human bodies. And then in Britain, over this period, while picturesque landscape gardens were being made, land was being reclaimed and improved, New crops were introduced, medieval fields and commons enclosed. So it's really a period of great upheaval outside of these picturesque landscapes. The cherished landscapes of Britain and elsewhere relied on and were underpinned by these changes. And so archaeologists such as Mark Leone and Teresa Singleton have explored how landscape precepts were exploited in the design of plantations and other colonial settlements, making even more stark the brutal contrast between this elite perception of place and those who worked the land. So landscape acted as a way for the elite to naturalize and aestheticize the extractive and violent relationships that they were involved in. And this all obviously resonates with Sylvia Wynter's arguments about the humanist conception of man, man with a capital M, which assumes a European man as the universal human, the observer for whom landscape is made, and foreclosing at the same time the same status to colonized and racialized others. Landscape then is part of the biopolitical project of European colonialism and slavery, fostering life, but only for some categories of the human and the plants and animals that they care about. It articulates an ambivalence about nature, we can say, because should it be cared for, or is it there as an extractive resource? And this is a history that's then taken up and challenged by landscape theorists in archaeology, particularly through engaging with phenomenological philosophers, Merleau-Ponty and Martin Heidegger, and influenced by Tim Ingalls' work. So this writing, particularly, Tilly, and I'm thinking of Tim Ingalls' work as well, and Julian Thomas, for example, critiqued notions of the natural landscape and of the separation of people from place. Instead, there's an emphasis on landscape as experienced and made in practice, always in process, and working within conditions handed down from before. In centering embodiment and non-representational forms of engagement with place, the landscape phenomenology of the 1990s prefigured the shift in interest towards materiality, material agency, and what has come to be called the ontological turn today. So there's a real genealogy, I think, that can be traced from landscape to where we are today. But as Matthew Johnson has argued, and I think he's right, there's a strain of romanticism that has remained in landscape archaeology, dating back to Hoskins, but also present in the engagement with place of these post-processual approaches. And although Chris Tilley's work was incredibly important for grappling with modernity's bifurcated world, it's also been criticized for the implied universal human that was assumed, a figure who walks the land and engages with place, but somehow still stands slightly out of the frame of landscape, even while moving through it. So although landscape has long been recognized as political in archaeology, its association with these landscape aesthetics and their engagement with the natural world, with nature, this has been very hard to shake. And it's particularly clear, I think, if we broaden the view from nature to its cognates, to think about nation and native, all coming from the Latin root nasci, to be born, we can think about the whole world of assumptions that's caught up in the idea of landscape, about people's relationships with place and who particular landscapes are made for and who belongs in them. So now I want to come back to Madagascar via Stonehenge. So also back in the late 1990s, Michael Parker Pearson invited our colleague, Remilson, Madagascar's foremost field archaeologist, to come to Stonehenge. And as we all know, Remilson's engagement with the Stonehenge landscape had a major impact on British prehistory, a not uncontroversial impact. Remilson saw Stonehenge as a place for the dead, because in Madagascar, stone is really for the ancestors. But his perception of the Stonehenge landscape, and this has been less discussed, really goes beyond that, because for people in Madagascar today and historically, to live in the world is to live with the dead. The dead are present around us. If you're in the world, you dwell among ghosts and other more than human inhabitants of place. So this really broadens the sense of who is involved in landscape, both interpretively, who's able to sort of interpret landscape, but also who is involved in landscape, the actors involved in the past. In this case, the dead as well as the living. And this relates to a critique that my colleague Severin Fowles made, which is that the phenomenological tradition as established in British landscape archaeology doesn't travel well. Where he works in the southwest of the US, he notes that local native communities would contest the ability of archaeologists to be able to understand the past simply through their interaction with its landscapes. So we can see this very different perspective on place with standing stones in Madagascar. Here's a lovely picture of Ramil pointing out this stone and its features to me. Now, stones in Madagascar are erected for many different reasons in the highlands. They're used to commemorate speeches, important actions. They mark boundaries, and they remember the dead. So similar in some ways to the range of reasons we erect stones here in the UK. But what's different about them is the commemorative practices that they're involved in they're quite active in a way that they aren't for us. You know, once a stone has been erected, it tends to sort of almost disappear from view when we erect a gravestone or a monument. And this is made clear by some late 19th century standing stones that were erected after missionaries came to the highlands. And what's interesting about them is they're carved with inscriptions in the Roman script that had just been recently introduced. So this is a stone found in a marketplace in a town called Betaf in the Highlands, and it's inscribed on both sides with a very long text. And what the words reveal is that the stone isn't a simple canvas for the script, but it draws on an embodied and performative understanding of memory, in which the dead man remains very much present. So the text begins by asking, "How are you, sirs? Raini Mandani Ariv, third chief of the Vaknakaratra here. Although our body was separated from you, here in your midst our name still stands, and so we're happy to see so many of you gathered here." So this is a stone that expects an audience. It has a message to be passed on, and this is reiterated by a band that circles its waist here, saying, "I am the stone that passes on the message." In giving voice to the dead, the text situates this military commander both in and around the stone, but also in the marketplace, in this sort of weekly meeting location. And his instructions relate explicitly to the market. So he continues, "Know how to sell, for fear of selling at a loss. Do not fool the simple. Be watched by God and observe fairness, and take care of the truth, because those who do well will not be bankrupted, and those who are gentle will reach a good age." So fine advice for everyone. This is not a stone, then, that just stands for Raini Mandani Ariv. It makes him present, and it provides a locus of encounter between him and the living. Stone, then, is a site of presence for the dead. It attracts the dead, and they're drawn to it. But if the dead are not cared for by the living, they can be dangerous, and so their message needs to be attended to. Here's another standing stone, this one erected in 1882 for a military man, Raini Zafi Niavu, and it shows him in military dress, complete with epaulettes and sword, and the inscription reads, "Those children who do not conduct themselves wisely will not inherit wealth." I note my parents are in the audience here, so I'm taking this to heart. It said that the stone was placed here so that he could continue to look over his rice fields, and you can see these beautiful terraced rice fields in the background here. So it shows how the dead are involved with the continuity of life and with the flourishing of the living. When we look again then at this hillside being scraped away for road building, we can see now the significance of the site's preservation in a different light. It's not necessarily because they're concerned about preserving archaeological heritage or even simply about respect for the dead, although of course that's a part of it. It's likely as much to be due to concern about the effect of the living on the living of messing with the work of the dead. And it was reported to Henry Wright and Ramilson that the workers did indeed think there was a tomb there, and so they left it, that's why they left this tiny fragment to the end to be destroyed. Archaeology isn't a discipline that's widely known in Madagascar. If you say the word archaeology, it doesn't mean much to people. But people do indeed know the past through the landscape, but it's primarily through stories and oral histories that are associated with place and its features, rather than through any sort of archaeological understanding. In Malagasy, the word for oral history is inheritance of the ear, luvansufana. And I particularly appreciate how this emphasizes the transmission through listening, the assumed community of listeners, just as we saw with Raini Mandani Arif. And I mention this attitude to history because there's an analogous way of talking about archaeology in Madagascar that takes up this idea and uses it to coin a local word for archaeology, luvantani, which means inheritance of the earth or land. And this is a word that's commonly used in discussions about ancestral land rights and the importance of preserving land for future generations. So, for example, where the road is being built through the rice paddies, people talk about luvantani, particularly in these sort of circumstances where, like here, you can see the road building here, where land is being appropriated or sold off against the wishes of local communities. So it's not an uncomplicated term to sort of import as a concept for landscape archaeology. It has its own history and its own baggage, but it's useful, I think, for thinking about how the land inherits and retains stories and actions from others, living and dead. It foregrounds the work that's done together in passing on this inheritance to the next generation. And it also draws attention to how this inheritance privileges some, but excludes others. So, let's see. If the critique of landscape aesthetics that I outlined earlier focused on the politics of landscape and its ideological dimensions, the posthumanist critique of the liberal human subject has also opened up into a wider discussion of the centering of human subjectivity. And this shift both builds on and steps away from the phenomenological approaches as researchers engage more with indigenous perspectives on place. And there are many different perspectives here, but there are commonalities which include reconceptualization of the landscape as animate in some ways, a rethinking of the human as dispersed through place and through other bodies and things, so a move away from the bounded human subject, and also distrust of sort of centering the human, sort of move away from centering the human in exploring modes of being in the world. So this comes often alongside an emphasis on multi-species assemblages and more than human forms of life. And this is all tied to a recognition that the epistemological and ontological commitments to place of other communities may be very different from those that researchers bring with them. And of course, the backdrop to all of this is the recognition of the detrimental human impact on the planet, named as the Anthropocene. This has made more visible the complicated relationships of humans to other entities and the ways that humans as a geophysical force have changed the planet. As we've often seen, this is frequently framed in terms of man's impact on nature, so sort of recapitulation of some of these older ideas. And this has led to questioning of what people term the sort of socio-natural assemblages involved in placemaking as a way to sort of push back on the way this older history is being imported into understandings of the Anthropocene. Really an attempt to sort of challenge these classificatory binaries of wild and domestic, nature and culture, object and subject. All of this has become a matter of more than academic concern in light of the changes to the planet. But at the same time, this recent work on the more than human and its placemaking has been criticized by theorists such as Kim Tallbear, Zoe Todd, and Vanessa Watts for, on the one hand, taking ideas that have long circulated in indigenous philosophy and thought without proper recognition of their influence, and also for sometimes discussing indigenous understandings of place without fully situating them in history, or recognizing how these understandings themselves are differentiated and sometimes confused and contested, rather. So coming back to Raini Zafiniavu, the reverse of the stone, facing away from the ancestral rice lands, shows Raini Masu, chief aide to Raini Zafiniavu. In other words, he was enslaved by him. Rainimasu is depicted in traditional dress, holding a spear. And while Raini Zafiniavu's inscription has been cared for, the reverse of the stone has not received the same attention. Rainimasu's inscription has weathered away to a greater extent. So thinking about landscape archaeology as inheritance draws attention to the politics of presence and to what is missing, to what is gifted to the future, but also how it's cared for in the present. Turning back to the literature on interspecies dwelling and the more than human, one of the problems with it is, like landscape study, it can tend towards a kind of romanticism and a fixing in place of indigenous onto-epistemologies. They're often presented as fairly homogeneous, unchanging, a kind of essentialism of indigenous place thought. So I want to finish by turning now to Madagascar to think a bit more about how we might historicize indigenous views of place, to undercut some of the romanticism of recent approaches, keeping politics in view while still opening up different ways of bringing place into being. And this is to really think about the promise and potential of recent approaches for landscape, while also considering their limits and constraints. So this is Andrian Poin Merina, the expansionist king of Highlander Merina, who founded a powerful kingdom at the end of the 18th century. In oral traditions written down in the 1860s, he's remembered as making a speech to the people he was busy constituting as his subjects. And he made the very bold claim, "Rice and I are the same. I have no equal but rice." So we've started our research project with this claim. Why constitute sovereignty around rice and around this particular vegetal imaginary? When missionaries arrived in the early 19th century, about 10 years after Andrian Poin Merina had died, they found a socially stratified landscape ruled from the capital city by his son, Radama I. And important to the emergence of this kingdom were particular lineages, descent groups that had supported Andrian Poin Merina, and their claims to power and authority were grounded in their connection with the king, with the wealth they had built through the slave trade, and also in the wealth of their ancestral land, where the tombs and rice fields were located. The families with the most powerful, the most power, and the most influence were understood to have the most powerful ancestors, and they received their blessing, essential blessing for the good of the kingdom. So ancestral blessing came down from the ancestors through the tombs and the rice fields. And this ensured that the kingdom remained healthy and strong. And it was explicitly conceptualized in the oral histories in terms of these valued rice lands. So on his deathbed, the story goes, as he passes his kingdom, as Andrian Poin Merina passes his kingdom to Radama, his son, he pronounces, "The kingdom has been gathered into one. Now the sea is the limit of your rice fields." And so, that's an exhortation to go out and conquer, right? Finish the job, conquer the entire island. But it also reveals how tightly woven rice was to the constitution of sovereignty and the creation of the kingdom. And if we were thinking in European terms, we might think of this as a territorial claim, that the state is defined by the territory that it encompasses. And certainly that seems to be the case to an extent. But I also think what we're seeing here too is not just boundaries, but rather the organization of governance through the work of Riceland and through its life-giving properties in relation to the dead. The highlands today, this is landscape around Antananarivo, they're characterized by landscapes of wet rice production. These have been in place at least since the late 18th century under Andrian Poin Merina. One of the things we're doing is trying to sort of track this coming into being. One of his signature achievements, as recounted in the oral histories, was the construction of a massive network of dikes and canals that brought vast areas of marshland into use as rice fields. And much of his discourse on water rights and irrigation features is also a discourse in staying in place, staying in the locales to which he moved people. The oral histories explain that the dikes that he built were not just to manage water, they made barriers, they created divisions within this new kingdom that he had created. People had to stay within the limits that had been laid out to them. At the same time that he's doing this around Antananarivo, he also was conquering other regions of the island. And here he enacted a forcible forgetting of landscape by displacing communities who were sold into slavery off the island or taken to Central America, around Antananarivo, to work the rice fields there. And what we found archaeologically in this particular frontier zone, the Andhra region, is that at the time of his takeover, when he moves into this area, the oldest sites, the sites with the longest continuous occupation that were still occupied, were also the highest sites, so the ones on the top of the hills. And this is where the most senior lineages would have held the high ground, the high status ground. After the area is conquered, the region is massively depopulated, and all of these old high sites were abandoned, but people still continued living, but at lower levels and lower hilltops. And oral histories tell how King Andrampoinmerina promoted some of the junior lineages to rule, and this was framed as giving them a history. It says he gave them history as far as their descendants and their grandchildren forever, whereas the rulers were killed, displaced, sold into slavery. So what's important is this isn't just about the past. To have history is to suggest an expectation of future survival because of the associated privileges, because history was inconceivable without a guaranteed posterity. It's tied to the relationship between ancestors and descendants. He also sounded a note of warning. So this is the highest site, the sort of main site for the kingdom. He says, consider the Andriana, the kings who are here on the highest villages, here high up. There was an Andriana on each one. Where are they now? So really letting people know that they need to, stay on his good side and stay on the side of the junior lineages that he's promoted as his vassal kingdom. So the forced abandonment of these important sites severed the kinship of the dead with the living, and people who were sold into slavery in Madagascar were called lost. And this loss references the loss of their ancestors as well as their land, their wealth, and their kin. So tied to the work of this 18th century state was the work of dispossession and slavery. And so we have to put this reworking of landscape in Highland America in the context of the major transformations in the Southwest Indian Ocean at this period, and indeed of the Atlantic trade. People from Madagascar were also sent to the Americas. So this is a radically different mode of landscape thinking, but it's firmly embedded in a global context and is part of the remaking of the modern world. So just to finish, I'm going to talk very briefly about some of our research, just quick recap. I'm co-directing with Chantal Radimalahi the Sacred Rice Project with other colleagues from the University of Antananarivo. And we've developed a field project that centers rice and the work of the land to think about the coming into being of the kingdom in terms that are meaningful for the actors involved. And there are three key dimensions: looking at the history of rice and land through macrobotanical study of plant remains with Sarah Walshaw, thinking with the ceramics used to eat rice, and the local earths of different colors that were used to cover their surfaces, and then through the earth itself through geoarchaeological study with the help of Yiji Zhuang at UCL. In thinking about landscape as inheritance, we're also working with Remilson and urban planner Tsai Hui Te, also at UCL, to think about farming, the growth of Antananarivo, and the effects of the inheritance of the land for people in the region today. And here we really want to try and connect up heritage discourse and conservation and protection of people's agricultural land. So our preliminary work, we've been doing off-site sampling near key archaeological sites in the region. And it's showing that in contrast to the narrative of human destruction of highland landscapes, it's a much more complicated and non-linear process. Yiji has found evidence that erosion was stabilized at different times, pointing to the management of landscapes and of soil being put down and sort of stabilized through things like terracing and things like that. And landscapes seem to have been a mix of woodland, grassland, and palms. Until the last 500 years ago, which I'll talk about in a moment. We've also found phytolith evidence in these off-site profiles of going back to about 1,000 years. So there's really good evidence of rice agriculture in the highlands from the beginning of the second millennium CE, which predates the earliest archaeological sites in the region by 200 or 300 years. So that's also quite interesting and something we need to work on further. But there's this shift. There seems to be a shift to more intensive rice production sometime in the 16th to 17th century. It's at this time that we start to find rice grains at archaeological sites. They're remarkably absent at earlier sites, and we've looked for them. We've done a huge amount of flotation at Ambuidahi, a 15th century site. The Sea Links project did a lot of flotation at Ankadivori, 12th to 14th century site. No rice grains. But from the late 15th century onwards, they appear very, very frequently in archaeological contexts. So it seems that perhaps rice takes on a new and more central significance around that time, around 500 years ago. And perhaps that's also the time when we start to see more of an investment in place. From the 17th century onwards, Henry Wright's work has shown that the population grows and the lower-lying marshlands that you can see here start to be brought into production. By the 18th century, there's a quite high population in certain valleys, and this creates localized pressure on resources and arguably leads to these massive infrastructural sort of investments in place of Andrew Poin-Merina, and that's when he starts bringing people in from other areas to help manage all of this rice land. In earlier periods, people would have moved. There's still plenty of space for people to go, but we're really seeing this investment in place, a digging in, quite literally, and we can see how that's reinforced politically in the oral histories, together too with the depopulation of other parts of the highlands at this time. So people are being brought to Antananarivo to do this work of ricecraft. So by the time of Andrew Poin-Merina then, he's arguing consistently in the oral histories about the proper management of life. And this proper management is always underwritten by the threat of death and enslavement and estrangement from the land. And arguably, I think what we can see here is another kind of biopolitics of landscape, one in which the management of life is about rice and the ancestors as much as about living subjects. And so to finish, thinking of landscape archaeology as Luvantani, as inheritance of the earth, is a very different imaginary from what we're used to. Rather than being tied to nature and notions of being born from the land, instead it comes from the landscape, from the work taken on by the political community. This isn't about ethnic identity, but about one's relationships with the dead through place. And some are more powerful than others, and this history and memory can be changed or channeled through actions on the landscape. And I should note that there is more of a concern with notions of ethnic identity in Madagascar today, and this seems to have been something that was introduced by the French under French colonial rule, and something we see also in many contexts in Africa, where colonial management undertakes a kind of politics of ethnicity. So just to finish then, I think, this perspective of Luvantani, it doesn't offer a solution to the problems of the Anthropocene or to the aesthetics of landscape, but it gives us a different starting point. I think it's useful for how it imagines politics along a line that's transversal to European concepts, but it's still very much part of the coming into being of the modern world, with its own forms of violence and its own forms of care. This is a place which didn't imagine political community around a territory and a native people, but rather through the work that's done to maintain inheritance and transmit it to the next generation. And this alternate political imaginary seems all the more important to remember in our current context, where politics seems to be doubling down on nativism and reinscribing the boundaries of the nation state. What might it do to think politics and identity as something made, something we do together in view of the past and its inequities? The inheritance of the land is not only how it's been shaped in the past, but it's what we must live with in the present, recognizing our own sedimented landscape histories alongside those of others. Thank you.
Zoe, thank you so much for such a stimulating and wide-ranging lecture. It falls upon me to give you a vote of thanks, and we'll do so in a moment. I was just blown away by the breadth, the depth, the criticality, and probably also the inquisitiveness of your research. And for me, I think it speaks volumes in terms of your own commitment to these landscapes and the people who inhabit them today, your research teams, your collaborators, and others. You've engaged us with thinking about the history of landscape archaeology and the intellectual origins of the notions of landscape, certainly in British thought, and how that has been taken up and transformed within archaeology over the decades. And then you drew attention also of how the importance of landscape has somewhat faded in some of the current theoretical debates, and you have repositioned it, and you have positioned it through a reflection, I think, on your own emplacement within these landscapes that have clearly transformed and changed since you began work there. You've highlighted so very clearly the enormous value of indigenous perceptions and ontologies and their contribution to the way we as archaeologists think and write, and also have highlighted how often in our own writing we fail to acknowledge those contributions of indigenous thinkers. And I really applaud you for your own listening ear, if you like, in your own work. And I'm reminded of a line from the Nigerian playwright and Nobel Prize winner Wole Soyinka, in one of his plays where there's a debate within the village about change and the nature of change, and whether the village should go down one route and grasp what is essentially a moment of modernity, or whether they should resist and try to retain certain practices. And one of the elders just reminds everybody to leave the dead some room to dance. And I feel that through your engagement with the monoliths in Madagascar, through your engagement with Malagasy understandings of materiality, of the ancestors, of place, of attachment, and of loss, of memory and recovery, you have indeed created a very different vision of landscape archaeology. So please join me and thank Zoe for such a fantastic presentation. Now, it is the convention not to ask questions of the lecturer after the McDonald lecture. There will be plenty of time if, after landscape, not quite the deluge, but a drinks reception at the McDonald, and please join us. You're all welcome to join us there, and it would be an opportunity for you to speak to Zoe. But let's thank her once more. One more time.